Sergio Perez has admitted for the first time that he's considering his Red Bull future, dropping a hint of what the reality of being Max Verstappen's teammate has done to him. Comments made to DAZN Espana mark the first confirmation from Perez that 2024 may be his last season at Red Bull, and that although he would like to discuss 2025 and beyond, if he doesn't feel he can contribute, he's ready to accept his contract not being renewed. Going through a real pummelling at the hands of an outlandishly good teammate is hard to come back from. Just ask Valtteri Bottas, who eventually came to terms with the fact that he was never going to beat Lewis Hamilton at Mercedes over a season. And this is an indication Perez knows he could be reaching the end of the line himself, which has big implications for him, for Red Bull, and for other teams and drivers in F1. We should stress Perez fully intends to stay with Red Bull for 2024, and to be honest, most of us in the F1 paddock, and you watching this video, probably thought next season would be his last dance in the championship winning team anyway. But after attempting to sustain a belief he really was a championship contender, Perez seems to have tuned into the reality of his situation at Red Bull. There's a common theory that the Red Bull is built for Verstappen and is fast but tricky to drive. The counter-argument, which both Verstappen and Red Bull team boss Christian Horner have recently made, is that the team's just building the fastest car it can, and Verstappen's prodigious talent and adaptability make it work. There's definitely some truth to that, but at the same time the RB19 is at least partly built around him, because he can handle certain car behaviour, particularly rear instability, in a way Perez can't. And Red Bull is always going to prioritise a faster car that Verstappen can handle over one that suits Perez but goes a bit more slowly. That's why for the second year in a row, Perez is talking about struggling with the car as it has been developed because it's evolving away from his preference. So Perez knows this car is never going to be tailor-made for him, which means he needs certain circumstances to get close to or potentially beat Verstappen, like earlier this season in Saudi Arabia and Azerbaijan. The problem is that Verstappen keeps finding ways to get better and fix his weaknesses, and ironically, it was the day Perez took his most recent win for Red Bull that the tide started to turn so crushingly towards Verstappen this year. As Verstappen gave chase to Perez around the streets of Baku, he started playing around with settings he could adjust in the cockpit to give himself a better feel. Max hinted at this straight after the race, saying he'd had to make some adjustments with his tools to get used to the different tyres being used this year, which give more front grip. Given Verstappen thrives on having a positive front end, getting more grip from the tyres actually created a balance problem for him, and at certain tracks, he was hurting his rears too much compared to Perez. Verstappen expanded on this later in the season after taking another crushing victory at Zandvoort, saying what he learned that day in Baku has helped him at every race since, and at the majority of those races, Perez hasn't been in the same league as him. So what did Verstappen change? The main settings the driver can adjust inside the car involve brake bias, the differential and engine braking torque maps. Verstappen and his engineer Gianpiero Lambiase spent much of the Baku race playing around with torque maps, with Max adjusting his braking technique too. Then in the closing stages, GP suggested another change, display 5, position 9, and whatever that was, it was the moment Verstappen clicked with the RB19. While it was too late in the day to stop Perez winning that race, it was a big step towards eradicating the few relative strengths against Verstappen that Perez could hope to have. So even Perez's advantages aren't really advantages anymore. He's being beaten emphatically, and this is all happening in a Verstappen-centric environment. Is it any wonder he's beginning to think about an exit strategy? While it would seem foolish for Perez to walk away from the best team and car on the grid, the outright most competitive option might not really be the best for him. Perez has had a good F1 career already and endured well for someone who has often been underestimated and written off as a pay driver, but this is not his whole world. Earlier this year, before Verstappen increased his advantage over him so drastically, Perez said that with a family back home in Mexico, he wouldn't be putting himself through this if he didn't believe he could win the title. It's a grueling mental and personal experience to be beaten week in, week out, and the upside of potentially winning the championship is pretty much non-existent alongside Verstappen. Perez is starting to sound like he accepts that, and he loves his family. He seriously thought about quitting F1 to spend more time with his wife and kids when he was unceremoniously ditched by Racing Point despite being under contract to make room for Sebastian Vettel for 2021. It was the Red Bull opportunity that stopped Perez walking away entirely, but now that is coming to an end, will Perez want to further delay switching to a better work-life balance? He'll need to weigh up what's worth sticking around for. But what Perez wants is simple, a chance of winning races and/or an exciting project. With F1 being in a healthy state at present, most of the teams tick either box. we can probably put Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes and Aston Martin as the most appealing options. McLaren, the soon-to-be Audi works team, and maybe Alpine are teams Perez could take a fancy to. And then the least appealing are inevitably Haas, Williams and AlphaTauri. But then it's a matter of working out which of these teams would want Perez, and frankly, it's hard to see any of the top ones making an offer. Red Bull sounds like it's ready to consider alternatives, Ferrari and Mercedes have no shortage of options, and Aston Martin will be chasing bigger names to headline the project. We'll put asterisks on McLaren and Alpine, given Perez is the kind of driver who could be a very good support act for either team, but would probably need others to leave or come off the market to be in prime position to step in. A Sauber reunion ahead of the team's transformation to Audi is more realistic. This team is probably going to miss out on its biggest targets because there are obvious question marks over how much Sauber can be improved by 2025 or 2026, and Audi is building an F1 engine for the first time. It's a gamble for either a young gun or an established megastar, and that could leave the door open to a Perez type, who would have a lot to offer, and the appeal to him is obvious given by 2025 it will be on the brink of a massive change to a full works team of serious repute. As for the others, there is the matter of whether a smaller but ambitious team will be convinced of Perez's speed and motivation, as anyone who goes up against Verstappen in the same team ends up damaged goods to an extent. But we would be surprised if Williams, Haas and AlphaTauri would all turn their nose up at a driver of Perez's experience and quality, so he will have his suitors. The problem is when we outline what Perez wants and who would want him, it becomes quite obvious that the options dwindle. Ultimately, it'll come down to how much of a step back Perez is willing to take. Given how he will likely be perceived on the marketplace and what he's said about what keeps him doing this, the most obvious post-24 scenario is probably an honourable retirement as a multiple Grand Prix winner and a national hero. Whether Red Bull doesn't want to renew Perez's contract or Perez jumps before he's pushed, there's a high probability that Red Bull needs to find a replacement. And the conversation about who could replace Perez for 2025 is quite similar to the one that's been playing out this year when there's been speculation about his seat for 2024. There are other candidates already within the Red Bull family. Daniel Ricciardo is an obvious one, although his bid to convince Red Bull he can be a legitimate Verstappen wingman has been impacted by his broken hand and a run of races on the sidelines. Red Bull's best junior options are Yuki Tsunoda and Liam Lawson. However, Tsunoda is really a Honda protege, and there's a decent chance he jumps ship to Aston Martin when that team takes Honda on for 2026 and Red Bull starts competing against its current partner. As for Lawson, the jury's still out on whether he should get a full-time AlphaTauri drive, so he's almost certainly not under consideration yet for Red Bull Racing. But in signing Perez, Red Bull showed it was willing to go outside its own driver pool. What's stopping it doing the same again to replace him? There's an obvious candidate for that in Lando Norris. His McLaren contract runs to the end of 2025, but he's been mentioned a lot in connection to Red Bull recently. In fact, Red Bull's kept tabs on him for years. It's a fascinating prospect because Norris is super highly rated and clearly one of F1's best drivers. He's extremely fast and adaptable and knows Verstappen extremely well. Now that might actually give Red Bull a problem. It seems unlikely Red Bull would want to risk upsetting the dynamic within the team by giving Verstappen a much more competitive teammate. But it puts Norris on an extremely short list of drivers who could probably cope with life alongside Verstappen. And it would also be a brilliant insurance policy should Verstappen's enduring irritation with F1's long calendar and frequent experimenting with race formats actually turn into a premature retirement at the end of his current contract in 2028 or even before. Norris and Verstappen would clearly be up for driving together as well. Norris has said he would be open to teaming up with his sim racing buddy in the real world to work alongside a driver of his calibre and see how he stacks up against him, although he's also joked that could mean Verstappen leaving Red Bull to join Norris at McLaren. As for Verstappen, he's open to partnering anyone, with the likely exception of Lewis Hamilton, but Norris would definitely be high on his list of potential teammates. And senior Red Bull figures Helmut Marko and Christian Horner are both open admirers of Norris's abilities and have tried twice already to sign him, and each time he's instead signed deals with McLaren. Marco's even said recently that it's a shame that the contractual situation means Norris isn't a more immediate option, given Perez's inconsistency this season. Basically, Norris is coveted by everyone relevant within Red Bull, so he's probably, at this moment in time, the team's number one choice regardless of whether Perez wants to continue or not. But a lot has to happen before that's even close to turning into a serious prospect, not least working out how to get Norris out of what McLaren insists is a cast iron contract.